Most people believe the most important decade for building retirement wealth is when they earn the most money, usually their 40s or 50s, because that's when their career is established, their income is at its peak, and they finally have the ability to save large amounts of money. So it seems logical to assume that those years would contribute the most to retirement. But when you actually run the numbers across an entire lifetime, something surprising appears. The decade that ends up building the largest share of your retirement wealth is often not the decade when you earn the most money. In fact, it's usually a decade when people invest much smaller amounts. And yet, that decade can end up building around 40% of a person's total retirement wealth. In this video, we're going to walk through a simple financial life from age 20 all the way to retirement. We'll look at how much someone can realistically save during each decade, and then we'll calculate which decade actually contributes the most to their final retirement portfolio. Because once you see the numbers, you may start looking at your financial timeline very differently. To understand which decade truly builds the largest part of retirement wealth, we first need to look at something very simple: how much money people are realistically able to save during each stage of life. Because the truth is, our financial lives don't stay the same for 40 years. Income changes, expenses change, responsibilities change. And because of that, the amount we can save usually changes dramatically from one decade to another. So let's imagine a fairly typical financial journey. Someone begins working in their mid-20s and plans to retire around the age of 65. Over those 40 years, income tends to grow as careers develop. At the same time, living costs and responsibilities also evolve, and that combination shapes how much money can actually be saved. Let's start with the first decade. In your 20s, income is usually still relatively modest. Many people are just beginning their careers. They may still be figuring out what industry they want to work in, switching jobs, or gaining the experience that will eventually increase their earning power. Let's assume someone earns about $3,000 a month during this stage. At that income level, a large portion of money typically goes toward basic living expenses. Rent might take around $1,200 a month. Food, transportation, utilities, and other everyday expenses could easily add another $1,000. That means monthly living costs might total around $2,200. After covering those basic expenses, there may be about $800 left each month. If that entire amount is directed towards savings and investing, it equals about $9,600 per year. Over the 10 years of this decade, the total invested would be about $96,000. This is often the stage when the actual dollar amounts are relatively small, but it's also the stage when the financial habits that shape the rest of life begin to form. Now let's move into the 30s. By this stage, many people begin to experience meaningful career growth. They may receive promotions, move into higher-paying roles, or build specialized skills that increase their earning potential. Let's assume income rises to around $6,000 a month. However, this decade also tends to bring new financial responsibilities. Many people move into larger homes, start families, or take on mortgages. Housing costs might increase to around $2,000 per month. Family expenses, childcare, groceries, transportation, insurance, and other household costs might total another $2,500. That brings monthly living expenses to roughly $4,500. With an income of $6,000, that leaves about $1,500 per month available for saving and investing. That equals about $18,000 per year. Over 10 years, the total invested during the 30s becomes about $180,000. Compared to the 20s, this is already a significant increase in savings capacity. Now let's look at the 40s. For many professionals, this is when income approaches its peak. Experience, seniority, and leadership roles often lead to higher salaries. Let's assume income rises to around $9,000 per month. But at the same time, financial responsibilities are often at their highest during this decade. Mortgage payments may still exist. Children may be approaching college age. Family costs, healthcare, and other obligations can add up quickly. Housing might cost around $2,500 per month. Household expenses, transportation, insurance, education savings, and other costs might total around $4,500. Together, that brings monthly expenses to roughly $7,000. With an income of $9,000, That leaves around $2,000 per month available for saving and investing. That equals about $24,000 per year. Over 10 years, the total invested during the 40s becomes approximately $240,000. At this stage, the ability to save is significantly higher than in earlier decades. Finally, we reach the 50s. For many people, this becomes the decade when saving capacity is at its highest. Careers are often fully established. Salaries may reach their highest levels. Let's assume income rises to around $10,000 per month. At the same time, some financial pressures may begin to ease. Children may become financially independent, and major life expenses may start to decline. However, there are still ongoing living costs. Housing might cost around $2,500 per month. Daily living expenses, healthcare, insurance, travel, and other costs might total about $4,000. That brings total monthly expenses to roughly $6,500. With an income of $10,000, that leaves about $3,500 per month available for saving and investing. That equals roughly $42,000 per year. Over 10 years, the total invested during the 50s becomes about $420,000. This is by far the largest amount invested in any single decade. Now, if we step back and look at these 4 decades together, the pattern seems very clear. In your 20s, you invested about $96,000. In your 30s, about $180,000. In your 40s, about $240,000. And in your 50s, about $420,000. So, if we only look at how much money was saved, the conclusion appears obvious. The 50s contribute the most money toward retirement. And that's exactly why many people believe the final decade before retirement is the most important period for building wealth. But there is a major flaw in this way of thinking. It only considers how much money was saved, and it completely ignores the other force that actually builds retirement wealth: time. Up to this point, we've only looked at how much money was saved in each decade. But retirement wealth isn't created by savings alone. It's created by savings combined with time. Every dollar you invest has the potential to grow for years, sometimes for decades. And that growth comes from compound returns. So instead of only asking how much money was invested, we need to ask a more important question. How much does each decade actually contribute to the final retirement portfolio? To answer that, let's introduce a simple assumption. Suppose investments grow at an average rate of 8% per year. This is close to the long-term historical return of the stock market. Now let's calculate how much the money from each decade would be worth at retirement, at age 65. The money invested during the 20s, a total of $96,000, has roughly 35 to 40 years to grow. By the time retirement arrives, that money could grow to around $1,400,000. The money invested during the 30s, about $180,000, has slightly less time to compound. By age 65, that decade could grow to roughly $1,200,000. The money invested during the 40s, about $240,000, would grow to approximately $750,000. And the money invested during the 50s, even though it totals the largest contribution at $420,000, only has about 5 to 15 years to grow. By retirement, that decade may grow to roughly $600,000. Now let's look at the share of the final retirement portfolio each decade produced. The 20s contribute about 35%. The 30s contribute about 31%. The 40s contribute about 19%. And the 50s contribute about 15%. So despite investing the smallest amount of money, the 20s end up contributing the largest portion of retirement wealth. And the reason is simple. Those dollars had the most time to compound. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. If the long-term return were 10% instead of 8%, the early decades become even more powerful. The 20s could build about 43% of the final retirement portfolio, while the 50s might contribute only around 10%. And if returns were even higher, say 15%, the 20s could end up generating more than half of the total retirement wealth. In other words, the higher the investment return, the more valuable time becomes. So what do these numbers actually tell us? they reveal something that many people misunderstand about retirement planning. The decade that contributes the most to your retirement wealth is usually not the decade when you earn the most money. It's the decade when your money gets the most time to grow. That's why the investments made in your 20s, even though they may feel small at the time, often become the most powerful investments of your entire life. Not because those contributions were large, but because those dollars were given 40 years to compound. Meanwhile, the money invested in your 50s may be much larger, but those dollars only have a fraction of the time to grow. And in investing, time is not just helpful, it's multiplicative. But here's the problem. Most people don't realize this while they are in their 20s. At that age, retirement feels incredibly far away. People are focused on building careers, exploring opportunities, enjoying life, or simply figuring out what they want to do. Saving for retirement often feels like something that can be done later. And because of that mindset, many people unintentionally skip the most powerful decade of their financial lives. The years between 20 and 30 pass without serious investing. And by the time people reach their 30s or 40s, they finally begin to understand the importance of retirement planning. But by then, one thing is already gone: those extra decades of compounding. That's why so many investors later say the same thing. They wish they had started earlier. Not because they didn't earn enough money, but because they underestimated how powerful time really is. So if you are currently in your 20s and watching this video, there is one simple thing you can do. You don't need to invest huge amounts of money. You just need to start. Even setting aside a small portion of your income, a few $100s each month, can make an enormous difference over the next 40 years. Because if you skip this decade completely, you may not just delay your retirement savings, you may actually lose the decade that builds nearly 40% of your retirement wealth. In other words, ignoring investing in your 20s could mean giving up a large portion of your future retirement fund. So the lesson here isn't that the later decades don't matter. They absolutely do. The 30s are often when saving accelerates. The 40s are when portfolios become meaningful. And the 50s are often the final opportunity to strengthen retirement savings. But none of those decades can recreate the unique advantage of the early years. Once your 20s pass, they can't be recovered. Which is why the most powerful financial decade is not when you earn the most. It's when your money gets the most time. And that's why the money invested early in life often ends up building the largest part of your retirement.